This is Central Asia, a collection of 5 former Soviet states covering a chunk of land larger than India, filled with oil and natural gas. The 5 stans, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, should constitute a vast area of strategic and economic importance. After all, this was the center of Eurasia's trade network, the Silk Road, for centuries. Today, however, these 5 countries make up a fringe and largely insignificant part of the global economy. But why? Why is Central Asia so big yet so weak? Why is it filled with natural resources, but economically adrift? Well, whether politically, culturally, or economically, Central Asia has always been a prisoner of geography. Landlocked and surrounded on all sides by 3 global powers, Russia, China, and Iran, this once great region of culture and trade is now a pawn in the strategic battle for supremacy over Asia's new multipolar political landscape. With continuous failed attempts by Russia and China to revive this enormous area of the globe through regional economic initiatives, the fate of Central Asia is yet to be determined. Can any area larger than India really fall by the wayside, into the void of economic irrelevance any longer? Or will the superpowers of the Eastern Hemisphere, that is, Russia and China, once again revive this sleeping giant and find a role for it in their quest for regional dominance? Well, there is only one place to start when trying to figure out how and why Central Asia's governments and people struggle so much economically. To understand this, you have to understand geography and how each nation has its own story. Geography plays a key role in a nation's economy, like its agricultural potential or its ability to trade goods and services through access points like rivers and flat lands. It also plays a key role in the strategic position of a nation, where large mountain ranges and deserts, while poor for economic purposes like trade and land development, have crucial strategic importance, since they prevent foreign powers from invading due to the impracticality of the terrain. When it comes to geography though, Central Asia is a bit of a mixed bag. About 60% of the region is made up of desert land. Turkmenistan, for example, is almost entirely occupied by the Karakum Desert. Much of western Uzbekistan is a desert landscape too, making any kind of agricultural development very difficult, and being a contributing factor to why such a big region can be so poor. In the north, for comparison, Kazakhstan's steppes are arable grasslands that allow for the growth of certain crops, especially wheat, which is the region's most important and most farmed crop. But central and western Kazakhstan, like its neighbors to the south, also have a vast arid landscape with no viable water source to sustain a large population. Between these parts of Kazakhstan, western Uzbekistan, and most of Turkmenistan, the human population is incredibly sparse. If you look at this population density map, you'll see that most of Central Asia's population lives within the southeast. Why? Because there is actually water there. 2 river systems, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, which drain into the Aral Sea on the Kazakhstan-Uzbekistan border, are the beating heart of Central Asia's population. The rivers run through the southeast, in the countries of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and parts of eastern Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. You may be thinking that these regions must be ideal for agricultural development, but not really. Unfortunately, even though along the banks of these rivers, agriculture and therefore human populations can be supported by a water source, these countries, especially Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, are yet again prisoners of their own geography. This is because the south and east of Central Asia runs along the Altai mountain range, among other mountain ranges, which extend into the Middle East and China. This means that only mountain pastures can be used to farm, which typically provide less space for crops. So, between deserts, mountain ranges, and a dry climate, Central Asia only has about 20% of its land irrigated and available for crop production. Which means that even though it's a huge piece of land, historically it's been unable to produce enough food or provide enough water to sustain and develop densely populated urban centers. That's why most people in Central Asia have traditionally lived in rural or nomadic communities. Even though today, due to rapid urbanization, about 48% of Central Asia's population, or 35 million people, live in urban areas, this urban-rural population split pales in comparison to wealthy Western nations like the US, where 80% of the population lives in urban areas. Still, the people of Central Asia remain extremely poor and isolated compared to other parts of the continent. Even the most densely populated areas of Central Asia are not newly developed urban centers, but instead, they are cities that were prevalent during the 1,500 years of the Silk Road, from 130 BC to 1453 AD. The Silk Road was the set of Eurasian trade networks that linked China to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Western Europe. Two of the most important cities along these trade routes were Merv, Turkmenistan, which was the largest city in the world in the 13th century with 500,000 people, and Samarkand, Uzbekistan, another city situated on the center of the Silk Road, known for its architectural beauty and turquoise artistry. Once containing the largest city in the world 800 years ago, Central Asia was an economic and cultural powerhouse. Throughout the centuries, Chinese people of the Han Dynasty, the Mongols, the Persians, and many others dominated the region, contributing to its diverse ethnic and cultural landscape. There is, however, one set of people that came to power during the 6th century AD, which made the biggest impact on the population of Central Asia as we know it today. These were the Turkic people. It's generally a linguistic categorization, because the various countries speak languages related to the Turkic language family, but numerous cultures and ethnicities exist within this categorization. All in all, the 5 major ethnicities of Central Asia, from largest to smallest, all of whom are considered Turkic, are the Uzbek, Kazakh, Tajik, Turkmen, and Kyrgyz. You can guess which countries each group belongs to. It's almost the same name. You have to understand the importance of these ethnic distinctions within the region to understand its current situation. After the Soviet Union colonized Central Asia in the 19th century and the communists took control of Russia in 1917, Central Asia was divided into ethnically based republics. This was part of the Soviet policy of national territorial delimitation. The theory behind this was that if a region shares a common linguistic, ethnic, and cultural history, it will breed a strong sense of nationalism. And according to communist theory, nationalism was a necessary precursor to a communist society. So the borders in modern-day Central Asia were carved out by the Soviets along ethnic lines, emphasizing the differences between ethnic and cultural groups within the vast region. Just to understand how important the ethnic differences in Central Asia are in understanding the political reality of it today, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, a nation on the southern tip of Central Asia, in 2001, it was their failure to understand these ethnic divides that led to the breakdown of the democratic government they installed after the invasion. See, Afghanistan was a country with various ethnicities: the Pashtuns, Uzbeks, and Tajiks. The Taliban in Afghanistan was set up fundamentally as an ethnic movement to push for Pashtun control in the country, a country which is over 50% Pashtun. When the United States toppled the Taliban and gave power to the minority ethnic groups, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, the new coalition government was vehemently anti-Pashtun and sought revenge on the Pashtun people who had subjugated and oppressed them for generations. This ethnic divide led to socio-political instability that lasts to this day, and Afghan society was destroyed due to the US government's ignorance on the differences between these groups. And ironically, it was the Soviet Union's acute awareness of these ethnic differences that allowed them to divide and conquer, and subsequently pillage the governments of a region that they controlled for over 2 centuries. Soviet control over the region led to the industrialization of countries like Kazakhstan in particular, as they attempted to drag this once great region into the 20th century economic landscape. In the 1920s and 30s, the Soviets began the process of nation building with their ethnic minorities, where they developed national institutions and education systems under unified national languages. This may seem like an opportunity for self-determination provided to the people of the new Soviet republics, but this only came after nearly 2 centuries of brutal conquests by the Russian Tsarist regime. Before and after the Bolshevik Revolution, Muslim factions within Central Asia were systematically crushed. In reality, the primarily nomadic and rural communities of Central Asia were dragged kicking and screaming into Moscow's system, often by violence or awful legal mandates. Numerous revolts and uprisings occurred against the Soviets, most notably the Basmachi movement, also known as the Central Asian Revolt. This movement of Central Asian Muslims in the early 20th century was the last attempt by the indigenous people of Central Asia to retain their religious freedoms. And only after several high-profile defeats by the Red Army, with thousands of lives lost, did the USSR make concessions on laws pertaining to their religious rights. These concessions were minor though, and the Soviets still continued to close mosques and churches throughout the USSR during the 1930s. This era of history really encapsulates the plight of Central Asia's population. They had always had stronger ethnic, cultural, and religious links to the Islamic civilizations situated to their south, like Persia, where they had originally come from. They shared almost no links to the Slavic peoples of Western Europe, who were imported into the region by Soviet mandates. So, in reality, while the Stalinist regime did provide some ethnic and cultural autonomy to the Central Asian republics, this was superficial, and it was done in the pursuit of having submissive communist neighbor states. any true sense of freedom was stripped away during the initial colonization of the region. Any dissident Islamist or anti-Soviet Central Asians either fled south to Afghanistan, were exiled to other parts of subcontinental Asia and the Middle East, or even worse. The Soviet era crushed the spirit of Central Asia rather than modernizing it. Peasants and farmers had their land confiscated after Stalin collectivized farms in the first half of the 20th century. This was because the possession of land, even the smallest and most insignificant piece of land in remote places like Kazakhstan, was seen as theft in the communist system. Stalin also requested grain supplies at an unsustainable level, essentially taking any grain production from farmers without payment, and either selling it or transporting it to urban areas in Russia. Because of these policies, famines in Ukraine and Kazakhstan led to the death of at least 5 million people from starvation. This period constituted a dramatic shift in the ethnic and cultural environment of Central Asia, changing the complexion of the region and its people forever. You may be wondering, did the Soviets provide any benefits at all? Of course, there were some meaningful and helpful changes. The Soviets did provide necessary infrastructure, building road and railway networks all across the region, especially throughout the two largest countries, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Although this wasn't exactly a necessary innovation for the Central Asian people, since they had lived for millennia as nomads and without modernized transport systems. It would be important for their economy, especially after Stalin's death, but not for the people of Central Asia though, as most rural farmers and citizens were serfs, functioning essentially as slaves, providing all their crops to the state and unable to migrate to Russian cities for a better life. The real benefit of the railroads was the transportation of crops, such as cotton and wheat, from these vast and desolate parts of the Soviet Empire back to the industrial hubs of Russia. But this production of cotton was a disaster for Central Asians. Even though it was a fundamental part of their newly modernized economy, the mass production of cotton required the expansion of irrigation canals using the Aral Sea and its river offshoots. This attempt to irrigate cotton fields led to ecological devastation for the region. Rivers dried up, and the Aral Sea shrunk to a tiny portion of its original size. This agricultural policy, called the Virgin Lands Project, was intended to increase food production in the USSR after a period of food shortages and famine. This policy during the 1950s and 60s not only provided minimal economic benefits to the people of Uzbekistan or the other Central Asian republics, but it essentially destroyed their primary water source in the Aral Sea, a water source that has never truly recovered. You can certainly point to this failed Soviet policy as a central reason for the poverty and instability we see in Central Asia today. However, other industrial changes were made during the Soviet Empire, as Russia discovered enormous oil reserves in Kazakhstan, plus natural gas in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Raw materials like cobalt, tin, and more importantly, uranium were discovered and mined from the 1970s onwards, with Uzbekistan's uranium reserves playing an important role in Russia's Cold War exploits during this period. In reality, these changes benefited the USSR and gave minimal benefits to the people of Central Asia, who by no means were able to accrue meaningful amounts of capital in the communist system. So, while early on in the Soviet era, some infrastructure and industry were implemented in Central Asia, the suffering of the Central Asian people was irreparable. And as the USSR came to an end, the region had simply been stripped of its resources with little in return. The lack of water, the exiled populations, the brutal Soviet oppression, all of this was hollowed out in the spirit of the great Turkic people, leaving them in an insecure geopolitical position during the 1990s, in a post-Soviet landscape. In this post-Soviet era, Central Asia was kind of left for dead. The new republics gained full autonomy after the USSR was dissolved in 1991, becoming sovereign nations. But now they had to adapt, with very little wealth or capital. The governments of Central Asia were suddenly forced to transition by reforming their economic systems, just like other newly independent nations no longer under the communist thumb. Their Soviet-style welfare systems collapsed, rapid deindustrialization occurred, and skyrocketing inflation further plummeted them into the depths of economic despair. To this day, over 30 years later, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan still have not made the full transition to a market economy. The transportation networks built by the Russians had begun degrading and falling into disrepair by the 1990s. That, and they had originally been designed to service Russian population centers only, rarely linking Central Asia to other parts of the continent. Economically, this was catastrophic, as Central Asians could not implement an efficient import-export trade system, leading to further stagnation. While some improvements to transport have begun in the last decade or so, trade and economic development remains difficult in the current context. And as each country designed a new political and economic system, some of them were incompatible. This fact, in addition to local political tensions and the Soviet-Afghan War, meant that intra-regional trade was stifled just as these new nations needed it most. This growing political turmoil, based on ethnic tensions and autocratic governments, were not minor either. The 1990s saw a civil war in Tajikistan and ethnic revolts in Kyrgyzstan. These were followed by a 2005 uprising in Uzbekistan, 2 more revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, and continued incursions by Afghan jihadists during the post-Soviet era. Sadly, this sums up the never-ending bad luck of Central Asians, forever suffering as prisoners of their own history and geography, forever landlocked, forever suspended between great powers, and regions with long-standing military conflicts. Their position in between Russia, China, and Iran has placed them in a zero-sum game, where they simply cannot win geopolitically. After Russia dominated the region for over 2 centuries, the last 2 decades have seen China invest in infrastructure and conduct trade throughout Central Asia. In a less volatile region, countries could form trade partnerships with surrounding nations, even when geopolitical tensions exist. In Central Asia, those geopolitical tensions are between superpowers, and the battle for supremacy in the region between Russia and China hinders real progress, as each side is trying to gain influence and control resources through their regional economic initiatives. Instead of the great powers creating mutually beneficial partnerships that yield benefits for Central Asians themselves, it is often only local oligarchs and elites that profit. This is complicated by Turkey's pursuit of economic and cultural relations with Central Asia. The linguistic and historical links between them are meaningful, but Turkey is another geopolitical powerhouse who are stepping on Russia and China's toes. What's even worse is that Central Asia has cozied up to the US and NATO since the early 2000s, after their collaboration with Uzbek and Tajik forces during the Afghanistan war. Oh yeah, and don't forget the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic connections between Iran and Central Asian states, as Iran has pushed for political collaboration, attempting to provide the region with their own economic vision for the future. All of this only exacerbates the geopolitical problem that is Central Asia, where it seems that simultaneously, both everyone and no one is their ally. Now, you may be thinking, didn't Russia establish an energy sector, where oil and gas could be harnessed and sold? Shouldn't Central Asia be able to sell these natural resources to their allies? Well, over 90% of the region's oil reserves and over 80% of its gas reserves are in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. So, tough break for Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan in that case. And while most of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan's gas is exported to the likes of China, Russia, and Azerbaijan, most of Kazakhstan's gas reserves are re-injected into their oil recovery operations. Multiple pipeline projects for the export of gas have been slowed down due to lower prices from the Middle East, USA, Australia, and South Asia. This global competition has essentially priced Central Asia out of the natural gas export market in recent years. Not to mention, these markets have been oversupplied as well in the last decade, limiting Central Asia's opportunity to do anything. And although the energy reserves are notable, and recent outside investment has helped modernize some aspects of this industry, the region's energy infrastructure has served beyond its life cycle. For example, 75% of Uzbekistan's energy infrastructure is more than 3 decades old. This infrastructure is so degraded that a catastrophic energy crisis hit the region in the winter of 2022. Uzbekistan saw an unprecedented collapse, with thousands of people being disconnected from their gas supplies, in the midst of sub-zero temperatures. In Kazakhstan, a country with the same power generation capacity as the other Central Asian countries combined, entire cities were cut from the grid, and 6 regions of Kazakhstan saw massive power cuts. Yet again, in the winter of 2023, we've seen more power shortages stemming from this rundown energy infrastructure. On top of this practical issue, many of the infrastructure development projects are state-run, resulting in wide-scale corruption. This includes Uzbek officials making backdoor deals with Russian oligarchs to control hundreds of oil and gas fields, siphoning revenue out of the Uzbek economy and into the pockets of corrupt state officials, all the while draining crucial oil and gas reserves out of the country. Even the thermal power plant in Kazakhstan that collapsed in the winter of 2022 and left over 100,000 people without heat and electricity is owned by oligarchs with close ties to former Kazakhstan President Nursultan Nazarbayev, a long-term figure of corruption in the region. These energy plants are renovated through taxpayer money, and while the Central Asian people invest in these projects through tax money, the profits are not only stolen by corrupt state officials, but the country's citizens are routinely cut off from their energy sources. This is the energy paradox that plagues the region, just another dark reality of Central Asia's despair, worsening their economic fragility and social unrest. The reality is, today, Central Asia doesn't seem to have a path of self-sufficiency. There may come a day where their location will make them a trade powerhouse once again, supplying the likes of Russia, China, and Southern Asia with oil and gas. But this is not a reality in the short term. Decades of neglect and lack of maintenance have made this a long-term goal at best. But will Central Asia's power ever return to that of the Silk Road era? Or will domination from outside forces keep this vast region powerless forever? Thank you for watching.